Samuel Rivers was a veteran park ranger, so when he was sent in 2013 to the thinly populated Thornridge National Park in Oregon, he didn't ask any questions. The place was one of those vast, wild outliers where the trees rose close to heaven, and the trails could go on for miles without an intersection or even a stray pop-top. Spooky, perhaps, but mostly it was a place that could be counted on to scroll right past the national conscience. This was one of those nearly forgotten places. That parks like Thornridge existed was an afterthought, and they lingered like sour memories on the political palate only long enough to begrudgingly receive their modest budget year allotments. So yeah, Samuel chalked up the place's reputation for creepiness to campfire stories. Well, maybe the ranger campground a little ways back down the same trail from Park HQ had gotten wild at night during the summer solstice, but that had nothing to do with Samuel. He'd been a ranger almost 20 years and nothing spooked him. But Thornridge was different. After a few weeks on the beat, Samuel began picking up rumors from hikers and campers. Reports at first were few and far between. A mysterious scream heard in the middle of the night, strange rustling noises out on the perimeter, even the occasional report of skeletal Herman-like bones scattered out in the woods. But what really kept him up at night was talk of finders keepers, talk of a secret trail. A trail that didn't appear on any map and only manifested for those lost too far off the beaten path. Samuel dismissed it as local folklore, until one night when a crew of experienced backpackers blundered into the ranger station in dusk, white-faced and shaken, their faces drawn and their sentences tumbling and panicked. "We found it," said one of them in quick, shaky breaths. "The trail, the bone trail." They said they lost the marked path in the deep woods of the north, and found another one, longer, and grown up with underbrush, but looking at first like a little-used animal trail. The bones began to show soon after they came upon the path. At first, they thought they were the bones of an animal. Later, they saw more, and then more. They were ribs and vertebrae at first, and later skulls, human skulls. The mention of human bones made Samuel's stomach turn, but it was something he could not ignore. He quickly gathered his things and offered to guide his companions back to the trail early in the morning. But they adamantly refused, insisting that they're not going back there and neither should he. They weren't just bones. It was arranged. Arranged. Like someone put them there. One woman stopped to whisper, fighting off the tears. Samuel wasn't normally a person who believed in ghost stories or folklore, but the fear in their eyes of horror was telling. As soon as the morning light touched the ground, he was off to find out. The tundra of the upper northern part of the park was pretty much all virgin ground, but it wasn't unknown for people to come across old graves or dens of polar bears or other predators. He'd heard of people coming up with skulls and bones of various wild creatures, but the idea of human bones bothered him in an eerie way that he's never experienced before. With the map, compass, and radio strapped to his back, Samuel was on his own. It had been overcast that day with the canopy above thick and dense, blotting out most of the light. Always twilight in this forest. The further into the woods that he traveled, the more still and quiet it became. The air muffled. The birds seemed to avoid this part of the forest. He hiked for several hours to where the backpackers said it was. And there, just as they had described, was an ancient and very old-fashioned, overgrown and almost invisible trail, almost like it was hidden there for decades, buried in heavy ferns and crawling vines. Samuel hesitated. The place shrank, and a feeling of dread almost overpowered his senses. But then he reminded himself that he has seen many ghastly things over the years. This was no different. He stepped upon the path. The deeper he ventured, the more bizarre it got. At first, all he found were bones, small, irregular, half buried in the ground. Most could be chalked up to being animal. But then the bones began to appear more frequently, and now they weren't at random. In places they were arranged in sinister patterns. Spirals, circles, and lines, some running down the sides of the trail, others hanging from trees by thin, frayed ropes. And then it hit him. These were all human bones. His heart was pounding, but he pushed on, telling himself this must be the work of some lunatic poacher, some sort of sick joke. But the deeper he went, the more disturbing the path became, the air weightier, thicker, as though he was entering into something old and something that didn't want him to be there. The path wound and bent, and twisted, turning tighter, sucking him deeper into the woods. The trees were ancient, bowed and knotted and spindled, their branches shaped into claws of wood. The ground spoke of oldness, too. Hard to the first step, but soft underneath, almost sponge-like. The smell was rotten. And then he saw it. Ahead in a clearing lay an immense bone pile, a stacked tangle of dozens, maybe hundreds of bones. Some animal, but many unmistakably human, almost like a sinister monument to death. Samuel's breath stuck in his throat. The rational part of his mind could barely process what he was seeing. This wasn't just a burial site. This was something else. The shock grew into panic, his heart skipping a beat. A figure, standing at the other side of the pile. It was tall, skin stretched tightly over its thin, skeletal-like frame. Its eyes, if you can call them that, were black, hollow pits. Its mouth, a gaping void that seemed too wide for its face. Standing there, impossibly still, almost like it has been standing there just waiting. The first instinct Samuel had was to run, but his legs refused to move. It was shock, but he was paralyzed in place. The creature cocked its head to one side. Samuel heard it crack, and in that moment her realized that this wasn't anything natural. Not an animal. No, a person. Whatever this was, it had been here long before there was a park and even before the trail builders. And it was not alone. From the trees, more creatures emerged, straightening up from the shadows, their skeletal limbs rustling and snapping as they moved. They closed in around him, advancing together in slouching unison, herding him toward the pile of bones. Samuel's radio crackled to life, startling him. He fumbled with it, his hands shaking. "Ranger Rivers, what's your status? Do you copy?" He pushed the button. Then his voice came out, shaking. "I found it. I found the trail. You have to send backup. Something is—" Just as he was about to finish that sentence, the radio went silent. Then hissing and screeching filled the speakers, and the forest around him. It wasn't static. It was a growl. The creatures continued, but Samuel wheeled left and bolted for the undergrowth. He breathed in ragged gasps. The forest closed in around him, trees warped and contorted. The ground tilted and swayed as if made of damp cement. Suddenly the path was gone. It fell into the forest. He had lost his way. The growls were closer, louder, and for the first time in his career, Samuel felt a level of fear that only comes in nightmares. He tripped, scattering through brush, his lungs crying of air, but he kept going. He had to keep going. The things that were somewhere behind him were still coming. They were not going to let him leave. But time passed. The woods transformed into what seemed like a maze. Earlier landmarks straight down the trail bent like canes eastwards until they disappeared to the left or the right. Samuel collapsed, gasping for air. When he finally looked up, he was on the other side of a creek, still crawling along its edge on his hands and knees. The growls were gone now, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Some hours later, in the early morning, the search teams found him on the fringes of the park, delirious, scratched up, clutching his radio like a lifeline. He tried to tell them what happened, what he's seen. But the story was broken, disjointed, incoherent. The bones, the silhouettes in the trees, the snarls. No one believed him. When they backtracked to the place he'd indicated, no path, no bones, nor any strange figures were to be found. The forest was as quiet as it had been at first. But Samuel knew what he had seen, and that the trail lay silent, hidden, waiting for the next marauder to venture too deep into its woods. He quit a month later. The disappearances at Thornridge continued throughout the years, but the trail was never found by those that tried to find it. Or at least no one ever came back to talk about it.
Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button, and we'll notify you when the next story comes out.